Good evening, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the CAPitalst cast. This is kind of a special evening edition that we're doing. We're very fortunate to have NewsBusters managing editor Curtis Houck joining us this evening. Curtis, you want to tell us a little bit about NewsBusters for people who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, NewsBusters is the main website of the Media Research Center. We've been around since 1987 when Brent Bozell and two of his colleagues/friends set off to create a national organization devoted to exposing, identifying, correcting media bias, liberal media bias specifically. So NewsBusters has been around since 2005. For many years, obviously, we were doing newsletters, physical newsletters that you would send out on a weekly or monthly basis. Now we're a 24-hour, 7 days a week news site with a couple dozen writers writing about everything from what goes on the broadcast networks to the cable networks to bias in business, culture, entertainment news. Tech Watch, looking at the latest censorship by the big tech companies, and MRC Latino, looking at Hispanic news media, Telemundo and Univision, running in both English and Spanish. So we're a pretty large operation given our weight, and it's been really great to be a part of that for the last 6 years now.
So I definitely, we're going to get into some of the how to be a good consumer of news here. But first, I mean, you have a really cool story. You are originally from Pennsylvania. Do you want to would you talk a little bit about how you got to where you're at?
Sure. I am a proud native of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, class of 2010 at Manheim Township. My parents still live near Catholic High. And I mean, I am just so blessed to have grown up where I did in Lancaster. It really keeps me grounded. Where I am now in the swamp of Washington. And so I, longtime Lancaster native, my family roots go back many generations. My parents are Garden Spot graduates. And my interest in politics really started in 2000, and I was in third grade, and this notion of waking up.
That makes me feel old.
Right. This notion of waking up the next morning, my parents telling me there was going to be an election, and the next morning when I woke up, I was going to find out who the new president was, and I did it. So that just like interested me. So I stuck with it, but it really started with September 11th. My 10th birthday was September 11th. So that really caused me to want to be attuned to the world around me and pay attention to the news. My dad went up in the weeks after to Staten Island, where they were doing a lot of efforts. They would bring a lot of the debris. And my dad, with a search and rescue background, he and his friends ran West 610, which was a search and rescue operation in the Lancaster County in central PA for a couple decades. So really that just led me into politics and becoming interested in that. My great-grandfather, Robert L. Ressler, was the namesake of the previous Lancaster County Republican Committee building. It's the Mellinger building, but the one before that was the Ressler building. So I do have a few roots in local politics. And so since then, my first internship was in the summer of 2012 at the Lancaster County Republican Committee, and it was just a wonderful experience there. Ethan Demme was the chairman at the time, and Justin Quinn was the executive director, and it was great to work for them. And then I moved on to here, actually. We have, over at the MRC, we have another news division, cnsnews.com, which just writes normal, straight news articles. And I was an intern there reporting in the Capitol, chasing down senators in the Senate subway. And it was such a privilege to be able to do that. And then I interned at the Heritage Foundation that fall as well. And during that time, I should point out, I went to Penn State grad 2014. And so at that point, I was juggling what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to work in party politics, I wanted to work at a think tank, or I wanted to work in news. And so I leaned towards the think tank or the Hill. And it occurred to me that this working in media was exciting. It was fast paced. It was, and specifically here at the MRC, it felt like a family. So that led me to NewsBusters when they had a spot open. So I've been here for the last 6 years. The first 2 years we're working as our sole evening news analyst, working late afternoon through the middle of the night, chronicling the worst broadcast network bias, evening news bias, Comedy Central, The Daily Show initially with Jon Stewart, and Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, all those sorts of shows. And so now, since April 2016, I've been the managing editor, and I edit, I write, I appear on radio. I've done over 400 radio shows and appear on television as well. Everything from the former NRA TV to the local Fox station here in DC to most recently pretty frequent appearances on One American News and Newsmax.
Right on. So let's kind of talk a little bit about media bias in general.
Right.
So what are some things that people should be on the lookout for, like when they're reading, newspaper story or they're watching something on TV? What are some of the things that you look for, that aren't necessarily, they're not the obvious, things? Like, what are some of the more subtle ways that you can use, that an individual can use to evaluate what they're looking at?
Right. So Leo, at the most fundamental level, when you're looking at a news article should be able to answer the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And specifically, if we're talking about elected officials, I should point out, kind of to briefly divert, the obvious point should be making sure party officials are labeled. And specifically, we see in instances of media bias where we're looking at, like, for example, one of the ones that I had early on in my career was when the then former mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, was nabbed in a corruption scandal. Everybody knows he was a Democrat, but a lot of the evening newscasts did not label him as a Democrat. I feel like that's really a basic fact when you're talking about who someone is. Like, when somebody passes away, you want to talk about what did they do for a living, who were their families, what was their career. So it's a very basic thing that's often missed when you look at bias in the media. I think we have a couple defined examples. Bias by omission is one of them. So I think, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I believe, but really, you're thinking about what's missing from the story. If you are a consumer of a variety kinds of news with various ideological slants, you might notice that there's something missing from the story. And that's really important as well, about the bias that you don't see. We saw that with a lot of the president's successes when it comes to the economy, Operation Warp Speed, that some people didn't really know about what Operation Warp Speed is. We've pulled that after the election. We found that it would have had a significant impact in a lot of the swing states, including Pennsylvania. And we also want to look at when they interview average Americans. Sometimes a basic Google search can tell you that there's someone put forth by a PR firm or what we call a covert liberal activist, where they ran for office one time. They were a former Democrat who ran for office in Iowa or something like that. And obviously that affects the tilt of a story. If they're trying to say that a Republican governor or the Trump administration was going to defund this from the federal budget, and this was going to be so terrible and awful and would cripple our family, maybe someone has a political ideology to that. And the same goes for the host as well. I look at CBS host Gayle King. She's a friend of Oprah, but if you Google her, she gave money to Obama Biden when they ran for president. And that's important for readers to know. And it's something that's not talked about. And also one of the last ones I'll point out, is we have many others, is kind of corporate liberalism, which you want to look at to see, like, for example, if a certain story about China is not being covered, you might want to look at, Disney, for example, which owns ABC News. So you might want to look into why ABC News might not be covering a certain story, because parent company Disney has business interests in China. And so those kinds of corporate synergy parts are important to overlook. And that really goes beyond just watching the news every day. And that's one part of being a responsible consumer of news, kind of knowing who owns who, and who these journalists are and kind of what's their story. It takes a lot, obviously, and a lot of Americans don't have time for that. But I think it's one of many important things you want to have in your toolbox if you're anywhere close to being an avid consumer of news.
Let's maybe transition a little bit to when you were looking at like presidential news coverage. What I think this is probably a good opportunity to talk about how you put some of those things into practice when you're kind of looking at stories and everything. What were some examples that you guys ran into during the presidential cycle, and even what are you running into now?
Yeah, so I think the biggest story was the Hunter Biden story. I think that's really important to point out on the news that Hunter Biden himself has announced that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware is investigating his taxes. So when the New York Post story came out about Hunter Biden's hard drive, or Tucker Carlson's interview with Tony Bobulinski, a business partner of the Bidens, those stories were censored by tech companies. I was censored. I was suspended on Twitter for tweeting out the original New York Post story. So that's one example that we saw there, where it's a suppression, but again, it's a bias by omission, as none of the broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. So while there's more than just 3 networks now, we like to point out, NewsBusters, that their morning and evening shows still draw tens of millions of viewers a day, plus however much on Facebook, as we're talking here, or on YouTube, on Twitter as well. Those accumulate views. So people see those stories, or they say tweets from certain reporters, or they read their local newspapers, or the national newspapers, or the websites. And if they don't see something in there, they might be curious about that, or unsure about the validity of it, because if the New York Times didn't have it, or CBS didn't have it, then is there something there to it, or did they determine that it really wasn't important, or was there some ulterior motive going on here? So that's one thing that we saw. And we polled swing state voters at the MRC after the election. We found that 82% of respondents in, I believe, 6 or 7 swing states, so obviously, as I said, including Pennsylvania and Georgia, Nevada, all, Wisconsin, Michigan, those kinds of states, didn't know of at least one Biden scandal or Trump success. And we found that 17% of voters would have shifted away from Biden, maybe not necessarily to the president, but would not have voted for Joe Biden if they knew about certain scandals. With the Hunter Biden scandal, 45% of swing state voters, we found, did not know about Hunter Biden's business dealings that, as we know now, are being investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And about 9.5% of those people would have changed their votes and not voted for Joe Biden, which is really interesting. And also Trump's successes as well. And our biggest one, we found over half of swing state voters did not know about the president's efforts to make us energy independent, which obviously is a huge issue for us in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we found about 5.8% of voters would have left the president, or would have left Joe Biden if they have that. So people should be able to choose our leaders instead of one-sided narratives that may hurt that, and it's obviously concerning.
So when you guys, can you talk us a little bit through the process that you use, to decide what are some of the, what are the things that you guys will flag? What are the things that you'll highlight? How do you make that decision internally?
Yeah, so our normal news operation, we prioritize, as I said, the morning and evening newscasts of ABC, CBS, NBC, and we watch those shows. And we want to make sure that, first of all, we first look at what, the chyrons. You see that as well. If you see with CNN, Biden, 100 million doses or whatever, or it's very just straightforward. Whereas with Trump, they'll have parentheses, or they'll say, dangerous.
And the chyrons, for people who aren't familiar, is the crawler that goes across the
correct
bottom.
Like if you're watching this video right now, you'll see that that's also where you will see someone's title, or the logo, or anything like that. Is people in the industry also call it the lower third, as in the lower third of the screen.
Gotcha.
So that's number one. So we'll look at that. Number two, we want to make sure that certain stories are not left out. Like, for example, this past week when we're recording this video in the news is an Axios story about Congressman Eric Swalwell being involved with a Chinese spy. There's questions about whether or not he had a romantic relationship with this woman, but at minimum, it was a financial relationship, as in being a bundler for his campaign. And it's important because he's a member of the House Intelligence Committee and someone who really promulgated a lot of the Trump-Russia collusion claims or conspiracy theories suggesting that the president has betrayed the country and he's morally been politically compromised by the Russians. So we think that's an important story and it's not being covered. So we want to share with our readers the facts about that story because that's something that's not being covered. Or the jobs report is one example as well. During the Obama years, you saw so many jobs being created and the unemployment rate continuing to decline. But one of the things that we saw is not as much growth in wages, which is an important indicator, or labor participation rate, the number of people joining the economy versus leaving the economy and giving up looking for work. Those are just two examples of things, one more recent and the other something that we look at every month. That we want to make sure is covered to see whether the networks or the major newspapers cover that. And it's kind of a checklist as we go through it to decide whether or not we cover something. And so for our emphasis when we write stories about bias by omission, for example, we'll lead with the fact that which networks did not cover something. And then we'll go into which networks did cover it and how they covered it. And we're not beyond praising networks for covering something. We're more than willing to say if a network is doing good journalism. Like the New York Times has done a lot of good work. Columnist Nick Kristof writing about porn industry and the dangers of that as well. So that's something that social conservatives can really identify with and really should know about and praise that as well. We're not out here to say that the media just blanket are the enemy of the people. We're willing to provide facts. And we know that a lot of what's going on here is nuance, but certain things, are beyond reproach about you need to cover certain things, or how if you're a fact-checking site, if you're not fact-checking what Joe Biden is saying, you don't have any fact checks, or 9 out of 10 fact checks are true, labeled true, whereas Republicans, it's the opposite, then that's when you have bias.
Gotcha. So as you are looking forward, actually, let's back up a little bit. Do you guys take a look at all? Are there any like Pennsylvania, like Philadelphia Inquirer, Pittsburgh? I know that those are quite the same as the New York Times.
Yeah.
But in your experience, in your history, has NewsBusters done or taken a look at them? Like, what does their coverage look like in comparison, or is it kind of all?
Yeah. Yeah, we've looked at the Philly Inquirer on numerous occasions. Just my own selfishness, wanting to see what's going on back home. I have a colleague whose family is from Philadelphia. He's still an Eagles fan, hardcore Eagles fan, and I'm not a Redskins fan. That did not change when I was there. But we do look at it's really, I think everybody, if you've read the Philly Inquirer and you look at the opinion section, specifically somebody like a columnist like Will Bunch, just absolutely crazy. So yes, we do look at local newspapers or as in kind of maybe second tier newspapers below, because I would put the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette kind of in that second tier right below New York Times, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, so to speak, as well. So yes, we do look at them as well. I keep my subscription as well. And I think on that question, it's important. I'll just rope in that even though I'm a conservative and we talk about the media being biased, one of our latest bumper stickers says, "Believe in America, not the media." We still are consumers of news. A lot of us still get the Washington Post at home, as that's the paper around here. I still have a subscription to the Inquirer because it's important to know what other people are into. And we believe that people shouldn't really silo themselves off. And we believe that we are only a part of someone's media diet as well. We're not trying to say that we should be the be-all, end-all, one-stop shop. We're just in one part, again, of someone's toolbox.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important to keep in mind, the silo idea of, well, I only get my news from this one source. People don't understand that that's equally damaging. You need to take a look at, what is the what are multiple stories saying, or how are different sources covering this same story, especially for something that's of fairly significant importance.
Yeah, like the presidential election as well. So for people listening in central PA, when I go home, my parents still get LNP at home. I still pick up the Patriot News or the Reading Eagle or the York Sunday News. When I'm around going to Sheetz or Wawa or Rudders or something. And I think that's really important. I think we're not saying that you have to agree with or believe what's going on, but I think, and we're not trying to say that you should make money in your budget for that, but I think it's part of a healthy media diet. If you're going to be interested in the news and you're subscribed, news organizations, we don't have to belabor the point, but they're starving for subscribers. We know that legacy media has been struggling for many years as we move away from print to online. So subscriptions really aren't entirely that expensive, but also I think it's important when it comes to television and social media to look at, yes, the 4 network affiliates in your area, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, but also in maybe CNN, but you might look at National Review on the right, and you might agree with more of what they are saying, or the Federalist, but also you might want to just peruse what people at Slate, for example, are saying, or the New Republic, or the Intercept is one as well. And then it kind of splinters from there into independent media, which you're seeing more and more of, individuals moving to this thing called Substack. Glenn Greenwald, listeners might be familiar with him as the WikiLeaks guy. He appears on Fox News a lot. A number of people have moved over there as well. And talk radio is part of that. There's so many different forms of media that where the left might talk about censorship, I think the right, as conservatives, and people that believe in the free market and capitalism, we haven't had any more resources than before. We've never had so many resources at our fingertips right now. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to take advantage of that, because it's something that we may not have had growing up, or our parents or grandparents might have had in the generations before us as well, which is really cool. And with that comes responsibility, but the ability to get a variety of sources telling you what they think is news, I think is awesome.
Yeah, and it's also important because consuming different sources of news actually allows you to have conversations with people who you disagree with.
Correct. Absolutely.
That's one of the things that I think has really kind of gotten lost, like with people essentially shutting themselves out from, the liberal media, is they're not able to actually have conversations with people who are apolitical, who are just kind of interested around the periphery. Because, those kind of folks who are convincible aren't consuming the same sources of news as you are. But if you have kind of that common ground of, oh, I saw this story in the New York Times, here's what they got wrong, or here's what they missed, you have the ability to kind of lend some credibility to the argument that you're making.
Exactly. And you know what? If you're talking to a progressive who's really kind of upset, or you see these stories about people cutting off people from their friend circle because they think you're toxic because you're a conservative, or that you voted for President Trump, that says more about them than you. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. But you are making an effort, and I'm all about being the bigger and better person in situations of life and work. And I think that's part of this as well, taking in a diverse set of news sources. And you know what? It's all about information. If you're a nerd and you want to learn things, chances are you will learn something. I mean, and that's the way that I like to think of it. And what's important to keep in mind is, that's really what I spend a lot of my time doing, is calling out news organizations, particularly a lot CNN nowadays, where they only focus on 2 or 3 stories a day. And what we like to see is, for as much as we go after the broadcast network evening newscast, but in 30 minutes, they'll cover 8 to 10 stories. And I think that's really important. And that really mirrors how we should be going about our media diet as well, as I said, by taking in a variety of news sources about a variety of topics, You might look at a tech blog. You might still look at popular science if that's your sort of thing. And the same goes for sports. We think about that. If you're a sports fan, you don't just read your local newspaper. You might look at a number of different things. You might listen to sports talk in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or anywhere in between. And sometimes in those bigger markets, there's more than one station. And that's the same way it is with political media, that you have a number of options, and you should take advantage of that as well, even if it's just a quick scan of the headlines. We're not talking about reinventing the wheel here, but yes, it brings a level of sobriety and maturity to the conversation. So while you might still get turned off by someone who's in their silo, stuck reading the New York Times or something like Salon.com or really MSNBC, you might watch Rachel Maddow, and that's the only show someone may watch. Again, that says more about them than it does you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate that you took some time to come on tonight. We try and keep this, under 30 minutes. So because folks do have so many options and so many choices to choose from, I really appreciate it. Was there anything that we didn't get to talk about that you want to throw in there?
No, I just want to, I suggested for people going forward, no matter how you felt about this election, continue to ask questions, continue to take in a variety of news sources. And I'll plug our own website, newsbusters.org, and I think that's what's really important, to continue the conversation as we go forward into the new year as well, because eventually we're going to be able to see each other in person again with the vaccine. So, we might need to relearn our social skills a little bit, but I think part of that, talking about the news, that's what, people used to do around offices. So I think that's just really important for people to keep in mind.
Cool. Well, again, I really want to thank NewsBusters managing editor Curtis Houck, a Pennsylvania native who I have to applaud you. You managed to get Rudders, Wawa, and Sheets like all in one sentence that you were talking about it. That's how you know you are a true Pennsylvanian. So thank you very much for coming on tonight.
No problem, Leo.
Have a great one.